Howdy y'all, and welcome back to the Texian channel. This is episode 12, Truman had no choice but to use the atomic bombs. Back in the episode I did on Neville Chamberlain, several videos ago, I relayed something that was said to me when I was an undergrad, in one of my first classes in history as an undergrad. We have to remember with these historical figures that they're real people, making real decisions in real time, and they don't know the future. And we understand that today for ourselves. All of us go through every day of our lives understanding that. We don't know the future, we make decisions, we do the best we can, and we don't know what those decisions are necessarily going to lead to. And we look back in, 5, 10 years, whatever it might be, and say, man, I wish I hadn't done that. Wish I had done something different. If I had known what was going to happen, I wouldn't have done what I did. But we didn't know that at the time. And we have to apply the same standard to historical figures. They didn't know at the time either. We have the benefit of looking back through history and getting a 20/20 view on how their decisions ended up. But they don't have that benefit. They made that decision at the time. One of the criticisms that I've been hearing, or historical debates if you want to call it that, is about our decision to drop the bombs in World War II. Now, as this video title indicates, I'm of the opinion that Harry Truman, President of the United States at the time, had absolutely no choice but to use the bombs. But there are some that disagree. In fact, I think Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, not too long ago, made the point that there was absolutely no excuse for it, that it was a crime against humanity and, dark stain on American history, something to that effect. Pretty rich coming from Vladimir Putin, but I think he's looking at it from the perspective of the Soviet Union and Russia, who had designs on governing Japan after the war, just as they were implementing communism in Eastern Europe after they had conquered that after the war. And by dropping these bombs and sort of preempting that and getting the Japanese to surrender to us, we locked them out. We locked Russia out of governing Japan after the war, and I think that's kind of why he feels the way he did when said what he said. But to me, there's absolutely no debate here. Harry Truman did the right thing. And I think as we get into this a little bit more, you'll understand why. On December the 7th of 1941, we were attacked. Pure and simple, we were attacked. And there was absolutely no cause or justification for it. Now, we had done some things in the 1930s in our foreign relations with Japan that many argue gave them no choice but to attack us. We had put some oil sanctions on them. The British had Singapore and territories in the region. We had the Philippines. The Australians, of course, were very keen to limit Japan as a burgeoning power in the Pacific. So the West and Western nations had put embargoes on them and done some things to try to keep them in check. However, as their empire expanded, many of the things that we were trying to limit their access to, they now had access to. Rubber, oil, many of those things became available to them. So in my own view, there's not a lot of, support for that argument, that they had no choice but to attack us. I think it was an egregious and uncalled for and unprovoked event. And I spoke to my grandma a little bit before she passed on about this. She lived through this. And she made the point that, in December and January of 41, 42, Americans were afraid that we were going to be invaded. That Japan was going to run roughshod, run riot, take Alaska, take Hawaii, perhaps even invade the West Coast. There was really a lot of concern about that, and I'll probably make a video in the future about our decision to enter Japanese Americans on the West Coast. I think it's a much more nuanced conversation than we're allowed to have, because again, Roosevelt doesn't know the future, and he doesn't know if he has spies or not, and what would happen to his legacy if, as we were scrambling to try to build an aircraft carrier, a saboteur from Japan got in and blew it up. Now, I don't think that's likely, and I'll make that point in the video, but again, Roosevelt doesn't know that. He's making decisions in real time. All that to say, the Japanese attacked us in 1941, and there was an awful lot of fear in our country about how this war was going to go, whether or not we were going to be successful. And really, according to my grandmother and a lot of other people I've spoken to about this, it wasn't until the Marines lifted that flag in that famous photo in 1944 that many people believed we were going to win for sure. But up until then, who knew? It was very difficult to know just how badly the Japanese were being defeated at the time. And you never know your enemy, right? They may have something up their sleeve that you're not aware of. For the majority of the war, the American people were on edge. And of course, they had endured a lot of privation back home. The war effort always takes that, right? We still have the stamp books, the sort of ration cards, if you will, from my grandparents. They're still in possession of my family. Some of our prized possessions, there's gas, eggs, milk, all of that stuff. The American people had gone through years of that. They had sent their sons to fight and die all over the world, as a part of this war, but certainly all over the Pacific, to die on islands that at the time they couldn't point to on a map. How many people can point to Tarawa on a map today? Or Peleliu? Or Guadalcanal? Most Americans don't even know what those places are. But to the families who had their sons and husbands and fathers and uncles killed there, they know what they are. And there weren't many American families that didn't suffer some sort of loss in this war. Many of those losses in the Pacific. So, we get through the war. We go through all of these privations. We know what had happened in the Bataan Death March. We know what had happened on Wake Island. We know that prisoners of war, civilians even, nurses, people like that had been taken by the Japanese were being abused and starved. They were not being treated very well. All of this was known. So the Japanese weren't doing a lot of things to endear themselves to the world and the American people. They had, you want to look at a tragedy of war, look up Nanjing, the rape of Nanjing that happened when the Japanese took it in the 1930s. They used people for bayonet practice, used babies for bayonet practice. Now, this was horrible stuff, really bad stuff, and the Japanese have come out and apologized for a lot of it. But it's interesting to note that in 2016, when Prime Minister Abe visited Pearl Harbor, he did not apologize for what had happened there. Now, the Japanese have apologized over and over and over again to just about everybody that they wronged, to be fair to them. But when Shinzo Abe was here, he expressed regret, but he did not offer an apology. In Japanese culture, that's very interesting, and you have to understand their culture to know the nuance of that. Many Japanese people still feel that they were wronged in the 1930s, and they had a right to lash out about it. And his speech was very well received. And there's a picture of him and President Obama standing at the USS Arizona Memorial. And clearly, he's offering thoughts and is contrite for what happened, but he never ever apologized for it. So, all of this privation, all of this death, the way the Japanese were behaving towards prisoners of war, the way they had harmed people. We arrive at 1945. The United States government has to figure out what to do next. So, what do? Well, they took a look at what an invasion of Japan would potentially cost us. And this is where we kind of have to put ourselves in Harry Truman's shoes, sitting behind his desk. The estimates that the U.S. government came up with, if we invaded them, in Operation Downfall, which was the name of it, it was a two-pronged invasion in 45 and 46, they estimated total U.S. casualties would be 1 million fatalities. 1 million. Now, some say it's more like 500,000, some say it's more like 1 million. However, if you're Truman, you've got to assume it's the worst. Now, we lost 500,000 men in the rest of the war. Combined, Europe, Pacific, and the rest of the war, we lost 500,000. We were going to double the total from the rest of the war if we invaded Japan. That was the prediction. That's what your own military is telling you if you're Harry Truman. In fact, we expected it to be so bad, we ordered 500,000 Purple Hearts in 1945. And because the Japanese surrendered, we didn't end up using those Purple Hearts. And so they have sat in storage all of these years, and to this day, when we award a Purple Heart, it was a Purple Heart that was minted in 1945. That's how many we made, expecting to give them all out in 45 and 46. And we now know that U.S. forecasts actually underestimated the number of Japanese soldiers that were prepared to fight us. I mean, when weak appear strong, right? It's the old Sun Tzu thing. Looking back now, in hindsight, and Truman, of course, didn't have access to this information, though he might have suspected it, it probably would have been worse than 1 million. It very well could have been. And the Japanese had fought, doggedly on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which, are not their home islands. So how on earth would they have fought for their home islands? They were training their women and children to fight us. That same report estimated 10 million Japanese deaths. 10 million deaths if we invaded. The amount of lives we lost in dropping the bombs, I think, was about 60,000 to 80,000, something like that. And of course, many more over time probably had cancer and complications from the deaths. But okay, let's say it's 100,000 who died in those 2 bombings. It's 10% of what we expected in just U.S. military casualties or fatalities had we invaded. 10% of that in just that. So, both sides were expecting to use poison gas too. That was another thing that Harry Truman had on his desk. An expectation and an anticipation from our military that the Japanese would use poison gas on our troops. Now, again, it turns out that that probably wasn't true. The Japanese were assuming we would use it, but neither side really had a plan to use poison gas. But again, Harry Truman doesn't know that. So what are his options here as he sits behind the table mulling what to do? The U.S. military is telling you it's going to cost 11 million people if we invade. And again, that's probably low. It would have cost an immense amount of human life and suffering. And he knows in the back of his head that he has these weapons that may be able to bring this war to a conclusion far faster and with far less death. And he also knows the Russians, who have recently declared war and invaded Manchuria and are fighting the Japanese on that side, they too have designs on trying to get their hands on Japan at the end of the war. And the longer the war goes on, the more likely it is that the Russians are going to instill some form of communism, as they did in North Korea, in fact, but instill that in northern Japan. We would have had to have split it, just like we did Europe and the Korean Peninsula. That's in the back of his mind, too. Now, there is some speculation, and I tried to do some research around this and verify it. I wasn't able to. Some people say that the Japanese had reached out to the Russians to try to get a surrender prior to us bombing them. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I could find no evidence that the Russians had shared that information with us. In fact, it's highly likely that they wouldn't have, even if they had known it. And what's more, even if they had shared it to us, we have to ask, why would the Japanese potentially be doing that? Are the Japanese trying to buy time to bolster their defenses on their home island? So drag out some surrender negotiations and then allow them to fall apart after you've, consolidated and built your defenses up on your home islands to prepare for invasion. And that's something that they could have been doing if they had, in fact, reached out to the Russians. And something that Harry Truman has to consider. So I think he really had 3 options. Number 1, don't use the bombs, invade. What would that have meant? Operation Downfall happens. Well, probably massive casualties. Almost certainly massive, massive casualties. Not only to us, but to the Japanese people too. So think about where his head must be at this point. Okay, I invade. This turns into an absolute slaughter and a bloodbath. How is history going to remember me if 20, 30, 40 years from now, again, he's thinking about this in real time, if in the future, decades from now, it's learned that we had a weapon that could have brought this war to a close with a fraction of the casualties and a fraction of the deaths? How am I going to be remembered in history? I'll be a villain. I'll be remembered as one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States. This weapon that we had spent so much money on, that we had developed to save American lives and bring this war to an end, I didn't use it and instead sent 1 million plus probably U.S. boys to their deaths. And we were running out of men. I mean, it's not like we had this endless supply of young men to send into this meat grinder. Sorry to be blunt about it, but that's really what it was. At some point, we've got to think about our own people too, and whether or not it's right for the American people and for the United States, who is the number one priority of the U.S. government. Remember, that's the chief responsibility of the U.S. government, the interests and well-being of the American people. Is it in our best interests and in our well-being to say, well, you know what, I'm not going to use these weapons. I'm instead going to send 1.5 million, let's say, U.S. boys to their deaths. So that's option one. Option two, maybe we can drop the bomb to scare them. What if we drop the bomb out in Tokyo Bay or something like that, or just offshore, in a place where they can see the power of it and the magnitude of it, and potentially, they'll see that and say, okay, well, if they've got something like that, maybe we need to surrender. Maybe we need to bring this war to a close. Well, these bombs weren't cheap to make, and it's not like we had dozens of them laying around. Right? This would have been a pretty expensive thing to just dump into the ocean. We also weren't sure entirely that they were going to work. And they had never been tested over water either. They had been tested in the deserts over in New Mexico, I believe, or Arizona, someplace like that. So how would they behave in a more humid climate? And how would they behave over water? We didn't know. In fact, I think when we dropped the bomb, we had it rigged for demolition. In case it didn't go off, when it hit the ground, it would blow up so that just dynamite or, C4 charges or whatever on the side of it, normal explosives, would destroy it, so that the Japanese couldn't get their hands on all of that technology. We just dropped an atomic bomb that didn't detonate, and they could take it and, use it to build one of their own. So we weren't 100% certain that these things were going to work, and if we just dropped it into the ocean and it didn't work, well, it's a total waste. And even if it did, it wouldn't have done any damage to the Japanese. And we're kind of counting on them to take a look at that and say, well, okay, well, maybe we should surrender, when they're giving absolutely no signs of any intention to surrender. We'd asked for it over and over again for them to unconditionally surrender, and they refused. And in fact, with training their women and children to fight us, they were sending a signal that they were going to fight to the death. So is that really an option to do that? It's a big risk. Last choice is, of course, to use the bombs. So what does that mean? Well, people would die, for sure. A lot of people would die, and it would cause a lot of privation on those towns that we used it on. There was no question of that. And of course, there's no guarantee that that would bring the Japanese to surrender either. In fact, we had to drop 2. So thinking about that previous point, and again, looking back in hindsight, Truman doesn't know this when he's making the decision, but we dropped 1 on their actual city and it didn't bring them to heel. So we dropped 1 on Hiroshima and they fought on. We had to drop a second one. So option 2 in hindsight probably wouldn't have been a good one, but even at the time, I don't think Harry Truman would have made that call or could make that call. The only call he made, the call he made was the only one he could make. There's no way the American people would have tolerated it if it was found out later that 1.5 million of our young men had to die because we were concerned about dropping these bombs on a people who had attacked us. And let's be perfectly blunt about it. There wasn't a lot of love for the Japanese people in the 1940s. You go back and look at the way they were portrayed in Time magazine and things like that. It's very dehumanizing the way they were viewed, and the American people were pretty damn pissed. They'd been through a lot because of what the Japanese had done. That was the mood of the country at the time. So there wasn't a lot of tailwinds for doing anything other than dropping these things. And the hope is, of course, that you use them and bring this war to an end. And we did, we dropped leaflets on Nagasaki before we dropped the bomb saying, look, we're going to drop one here too. You heard about what happened in Hiroshima? We're going to drop one here too. We did everything we could to try to limit casualties. We did everything we could to try to do this in as humane a way as possible. Truman, sitting behind his desk in 1905, could not have made any decision other than the one he made. And I think any fair viewing of history will look back and say that it was the right thing to do. You know, it's entirely possible, and this is just speculation, but it's entirely possible that if we had invaded and the Japanese had fought for their home islands as hard or harder than they fought on Iwo and Okinawa, which were Japanese possessions at the time, but not their home islands, I think it's entirely possible that the Japanese race might very well have been wiped out, with the exception of the Japanese Americans that we had interred in the United States. It's entirely possible they would have fought to the last man for their emperor and for their home islands. I think, no way. Well, what if someone invaded the United States? You know, do you think American citizens wouldn't fight to the last to defend our freedom? You know, that men and women would band together. You know, we've made movies about Red Dawn and things like that, you know. I mean, we would fight to the death too. And culturally speaking, the Japanese had far more of an inclination to behave in that way. And this was all known. These were things that we knew and that Harry Truman knew. We had no choice but to drop these bombs, and it was the right thing to do. It ended the war far faster than an invasion would have. And again, we have to consider that these are real people in real time making real decisions, and they don't know the future. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I welcome your comments. If you agree with that perspective or disagree, please let me know in the comments section. I'd love to hear what you think. Love to hear what your perspective is. As always, it's my pleasure to talk to you. Until next time,